this session I'm going to explain, or at least try to explain, the various types of references in Microsoft Excel. It's somewhat of a difficult concept to grasp, but it is very widely used if you want it to be successful in using Microsoft Excel and get somewhat of a good grasp on using it. So notice on the previous video that I covered, I was referencing here, instead of using numbers as part of the formula, instead use references. For example, pay periods, instead of putting times 6 or times 12 in here to get the annual pay for the employee, you'd reference it to the number of pay periods, referenced somewhere else in another cell. But when we did that, if you notice that when I used the autofill feature, that those cells, what happened, that they got messed up. So for example, notice we have G23 times J17. If we go to the next thing, you have G24 times J18. So what happened there was it's going one further down below our pay period. Then if we drop down to the next one, notice it went down to 2, and that's because we went down. So the way autofill works is that it goes sequentially, 1-to-1 relationship. Now that leads us to the types of references. In Excel, those references that we used here, like G23 and J17, those are relative references. So in Excel, you have 3 types of references. You have relative references, so that's relative to the location where they are. Absolute references, and mixed references. What that would mean is that, so for example, 5% here, to express it as a relative reference, we could express that simply by typing equal and then C4. Notice that's the relative reference. It's not locked, it's not any of that type of stuff. Now, absolute references, you can express that by C4, but if you put $signs to both the column and the row, that makes it an absolute reference. That means that wherever you're using the $signs, it's always not going to shift down on you. So $signs, that's what makes them absolute references. So notice at this point it's still showing me 5%, the actual content of it, but it just has the $signs. Now one other thing here in the $signs, if instead of you having to type the $sign manually as part of a formula, you can press the F4 key on the keyboard, and that will change between a relative reference to an absolute reference with the $signs to a mixed reference. And a mixed reference can be one where only part of the reference has a $sign. So in this case, it is the row that is being locked down. Like notice the $sign is in front of number C4 here, so for 4. And then the other type of mixed reference here would be, I'm pressing F4 again, notice the $sign now switched places, and we are locking it by the column. So there are different uses for locking just a column or just a row, but let me explain it a little bit further here. So the relative reference here would be C4, and I'm just typing it at this point. The absolute reference would be $C, $4, and they don't have to be capitalized. A mixed reference could be either one of them. It could be $C and then number 4, or C and then $4. Let me explain the difference between the relative and absolute references in this example. So let's say we have a budget for your department of $20,000 a year. And because of the economy or because of whatever reason, you need to decrease your budget by 5%. So your boss comes to you and says, training is not going to be $4,000 anymore, you have to give up 5%. and then office supplies the same, and so on. Now you have to calculate what your difference will be. So in this cell here on D6, we are going to calculate the difference. So the difference in this point, if you remember the previous tutorials, you calculate it by putting the equal sign, and then you do 4,000, which will be C6, times 5%. So in this case, we just click on the C4, that's our reference, hit enter. Notice we have to give up $200. Now if you did this, you can go manually and do this for every cell here, and it will work just fine. However, if you wanted to make it easier for yourself and simply drag this down by using the autofill feature, notice that things will not work correctly. Notice it says $200 for the first one, and then we have to give up $32 million for computer expenses when we had only $8,000. So what's happening here? What's happening is that, notice, on the first one, it's calculating 4,000 times 5%. On the second one, which is C6 times C4. On the next one, it's going to be C7 times C5. So it went one down, which means it's calculating 100 times blank. So 100 times 0, it's 0. On the next one, it's going C8 times C6. So it's calculating 8,000 times 4,000. So it's shifting one at a time. So what we want to do is we want to lock it for this 5% so it stays put. So to lock it, all you have to do is make this C4, make it an absolute reference. So you can do the F4 there. Notice it puts the dollar signs, 2 of them. Hit enter. For the first reference, it doesn't change anything. It's still the same $200. But if you populate this down to the rest, notice we have the proper values. So 5% of 2,000, it's $100 in this case that we have to give up. So that's basically why you'd use the references. Now, if you wanted to change this to 8%, all you have to change is this number, 8%, and notice those values are updated automatically. So hopefully that makes sense on why you'd use the absolute references here. It's basically so that you don't run into the same problem that we did over here as well. So now to correct this one, all we have to do is we come over here and we want to make this value, J17, we want to make it an absolute reference. So we do F4, or you put the dollar signs manually, but F4 is going to be much easier to change the mode there. Hit enter, then use the autofill, and now we have the correct calculations. So that's the difference between relative references. Relative references don't have the dollar sign. They kind of jump sequentially as you use the autofill feature, and absolute references where you're pointing to a specific cell and you don't want it to move. You want it to stay put. The difference for the mixed references, what that means is that you are locking it either by just the column. So let's say you have a bunch of references for different rates and you want to lock them by the column. In that case, you'd lock it, put the dollar sign in front of the column, whatever it would be, a C, whatever. And then if you had multiple values in a row, so let's say 10% here, and then 12%, and so on, and you want to lock it only by the row, then you'd use the dollar sign by number 4. You're telling it let it move down from column to column, but not the rows, let it be locked at that point. There are less common uses for that. I'm not going to spend the time to explain it for the sake of saving your time here. So now in this case, if you wanted to calculate the new budget, you'd click on the equal sign here, and you say, my new budget is 4,000 minus this value, hit enter, and then drag it down, and then everything gets correct. Of course, double check it, and that should explain the use of absolute and relative references.